Hello, thank you everyone for joining us here this evening for an Olana webinar, An Artist Perspective, the Process of Plein Air. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Shawn Dell Joyce. Shawn is a Florida-based plein air painter and founder of the Wallkill River School of Art, based in Orange County, New York. As a skilled teacher, she has a tremendous impact on the art community nationwide, teaching workshops in pastel and plein air techniques across the country, including here at Olana. We're so excited to have Shawn join us this coming September for another workshop, and we will plug that again later on in today's presentation. Shawn's work has been featured in publications from the Tampa Bay Magazine to the New York Times, and she's represented in galleries across the country and has been widely collected by corporations and families around the world, and including the Georges Pompidou Museum in France and the Museum of Modern Art. We are so grateful to have Shawn join us for this evening's exploration into plein air and perhaps Frederic Church's own artistic process. Please join me in welcoming Shawn Dell Joyce for this evening's webinar.
Thank you so much, Gracie, and I'm dying to see some of your work now that I know that you sketch. Speaking of which, if you would like to sketch with me tonight, all you need is a pencil and a piece of paper. And we would love to see what you wind up doing. So stay tuned and we'll tell you how to share your work later. Now, as Gracie said, I spent a lot of time studying the Hudson River School and painting some of the same scenes that Church, Durand, and the other artists painted, and scenes I'm sure you have admired as well. As a painter, it can be daunting to stand in these beautiful places and narrow your focus to just one thing and decide what to paint. So imagine if you were going on a foray with Cole and Church out on the gardens of Olana to look for something to paint. How would you choose? Before we get started, I want to show you some of the paintings that Church has done that have been studies possibly of some of the same trees or tree types that you would see at Olana today. This is the study we'll be working from. And I'm sure looking at it, if you pass this by in the forest, you might not give it a second thought. But Church felt it compelling enough to paint. Here is another one of his incredible sketches. And by the way, we often do multiple sketches at a time of different scenes to determine which one is the best, would make the best composition. And here, this one is slightly different. You see stronger verticals and almost a single diagonal going straight through the middle. And finally, and these delicious paintings, by the way, are going to be on view at Olana. So if you would like to see them up close and personal, the show opens next month. So you'll be able to see these sketches I'm showing you and be able to take a very close look. We can get rid of this. This one, if you can get past the frame, you can see some incredible depth to the painting. Now, it isn't just magical thinking, or as Van Gogh would say, witchcraft, that makes an artist decide what vision they would like to put on canvas or paper. It's actually the same kind of thing you use with your camera, and that's called the rule of thirds. Now, a rule of thirds, I don't know if you can see this on my camera. We'll switch to the easel in just a moment. Rule of thirds are the guidelines that you see, the format that pops up whenever you open your camera. This rule of thirds is actually something that painters use and has transformed into photography with the invention of the camera. And basically what it means is, how do you frame out this incredible view and make it something compelling? So we're going to take a look at the easel. If you'll join me over at the easel. Now, on first glance, you'll see the trees. The trees have some very strong lines to them. When you put the rule of thirds format up on the trees, then you start to see how Church was actually kind of scientific in his choice of using these trees. So notice how close this tree lines up with this rule of thirds line, and how these two trees intersect right at this focal point. Now, with the rule of thirds, you want to keep your focal points near the intersection, and you don't want to draw people's attention too much off the page. So he put a couple of little bookmarks here to keep your eye in the scene. He has this strong diagonal leading you to this, another strong diagonal that intersects, and you can see the structure. This is like the armature under the painting. And Church probably put a good amount of thought into what to paint before he settled upon this particular view. When I'm painting out in plein air, I will often hold my fingers like this and look through them to frame out a view. You may have seen artists doing it. Another method is to squint. And when you squint, you see a very blurry view of the scene. And this shows you really just the abstract composition. So most of us, when we're determining a view, will use one of these two methods to help us narrow down this beautiful three-dimensional world to 2 dimensions to make a painting. Now, before any paint hits the canvas, most of us do a sketch, and the sketch is called a value sketch. A value sketch should never be very big. This is a typical value sketch for me. It's about 3 inches by 5 inches. It has the rule of thirds format, so I know roughly that my focal point is going to hit here, and I'll have secondary focals in other places, but this is really where I want to pull your eye. So from this value sketch, I'll go on and possibly do a color study. I'm a pastelist, so a color study only takes about 10 minutes. And then from that, I'll do a finished painting, which I'll take my time on because I've already made all my mistakes. So this is the finished piece that was based on those color studies. So it sounds a little time consuming, but doing a value sketch like this should never take more than 10 minutes. A color study like this should take about 15. You can see how the values inform the colors. So value is the gradations from dark to light. Color is also something that has value. So you have to work with value first and sketch to be able to understand the value in colors. But here you can see the darks, the middles, and the lights. And the finished piece, and these are both acrylic paintings. The finished piece looks something like this. So you can see how the sketches really help to inform the finished piece. As an artist, I want to make all my mistakes on paper and not large scale on canvas. As a plein air artist, I only have about 10 minutes before the light starts to change. So I want to be very conscientious about how I use my time. So grab your pencils, pull up a sheet of paper, doesn't have to be anything fancy. You should be able to see this reference photo pretty well and my screen. I'm going to start off with a simple pencil. This is a leadless pencil. Now, artists, when they hold the pencil, they hold it a little different. When you're writing, you would hold it like this. When you're sketching, you want to be loose and hold it in a way that gives you a lot of free motion. So the first thing is I'm going to position where the main characters are in the sketch. So I'm using this rule of thirds. I can see that the forest floor starts in this lower left corner and lightly comes up to the stump, which is a bookend. You know, there's some wonderful writing about the philosophy of the Hudson River School and transcendentalism and why they chose to put in some things and exclude others. For example, why have a stump? Why a cut down tree? And I think a lot of it is this is the hand of man. This is the beauty of nature. And it contrasts the two, but always with nature coming out on top. Now, here is one of my areas of focal. So I want to be real careful and have this tree cut through at a diagonal. So notice that it comes really close to this intersection as well as this intersection. So this creates a very strong area of interest or a focal edge. This tree will lead your eye through the composition. This second tree, which is in the back, comes really close to that vertical line, but there's some space between them. We have another stump, this one with a little more character. And we have the stumps behind. Now, interestingly, there is an intersection, this square. In art, this would be called the negative space shape. Sometimes it's easier to sketch the shape of that space than it is to try to sketch what's around it. The trees, the stumps, very complicated. So I'm just sketching that negative space shape, and that helps to give me the edge of the stump and the fallen tree and so forth. Okay, so this leads me to the second intersecting tree. And again, right now, I'm just putting in the big shapes so that I know the composition. Once I have the shapes in place, then I'll start working on values. Right. Now, in the foreground, there is a great big gnarly tree trunk. I want to try to pay homage to Church and get everything that he included. Some of my favorite paintings and artworks of Church are the ones that he probably never intended for anyone else to see. And those are ones in his sketchbook. Some of his sketches, which were usually done on brown paper, here is an example. It's not very clear because I don't have a high resolution, but you can see different values in these trees and different pressure that he put on the pencil as he was sketching. And I love the looseness of his sketches. It's almost as if you're watching a dancer in the privacy of their own home when they think no one else is watching. You know, you get to be looser and more yourself. You can experiment. And being a much sought after artist, there was a lot of pressure on him to produce really fine quality paintings each time. So the sketches are the only place where he could be him, or we as artists can be ourselves and try out new ideas and techniques without worrying about failing at the market. So they're candid looks behind the scenes. And if you get a chance to poke around in his studio space at Olana, you can see some of the methodology he used, some of the books that influenced him, and some of the sketches there. Okay, so some of my shapes are not going to be perfect or exact compared to his, which is fine with me. I don't think the purpose of it is to be perfect. I think the purpose of it is more to do the exercise and understand values. Once I have the big shapes in place, these are the big compositional elements in the painting, then I'm ready to start with the values. Now, artists always work from dark to light because you need to have something to go off of. If you're sketching, you're obviously going to be working from dark to light, white being blank paper. If you're painting, you would work from dark to light with oil, acrylic, pastel, wash, other mediums. Watercolor, you would have to do the opposite because you leave white paper and go back. For our purposes with the Hudson River School, most of the studies they did were oil and were from dark to light. So first thing I'm going to do is look at the reference photo, and I printed this out as a sepia tone so that it's easier for you to see values. This is full color. Color can be confusing. When you look at the color, it's a little hard to differentiate the value of the tree compared to the value of the background. You can differentiate the color, but when you see it as black and white, you can see it, or even just sepia, you can see the values a little clearer. So for my purposes in sketching, I'm going to work from the sepia for now and come back to the color at the very end. So with the sepia, I also love the old-fashioned look of sepia. Who doesn't? When you squint and you look at it in a blurred way, you'll notice that the darkest dark and the lightest light coincide right here, which is where our focal area on the rule of thirds is. So it's no accident that Church would put the darkest dark and the lightest light pretty much together. Now, what I'm talking about is when you look at the scene, your eye tracks immediately to the darkest area. So the darkest darks are usually in the foreground. The lightest lights tend to be where the sun is hitting or in the background. So here he has these beautiful rich darks that lead your eye to this spot, and then some beautiful rich darks that help to frame out the other spots. So notice how most of the intense darks are in the foreground. Everything behind these trees is lighter and cooler in color. So that helps to create distance in a painting. So you have a foreground and a background. So we're going to start off by putting some of these rich darks in place and sketching hard. So my darkest dark is how dark I can get bearing down on the pencil and cross hatching. So this is about the darkest I can make it right there. So with this dark, and it's relative to everything else in the painting, with this dark, I'm going to start at the focal area, show that part of the dark. And then some of the darks that are in the foreground as cast shadows, under the log. I can't tell by the bark, but I'll bet you anything this is a hemlock tree. The hemlock trees were prevalent all over Olana and the region, the Hudson Valley, until the iron ore rush came and tanning. They started burning up the hemlocks in the furnaces and taking the bark for tanning. So we saw a wholesale cutting down of hemlock forests and trees. Olana has taken great efforts to repopulate the property with hemlock trees. So now you can see a lot of hemlocks as they would have naturally been had the hand of man not intervened. Okay, at this point, I have almost all the darkest darks. Just going up the side of that tree. And then a little down here. So that would be the 5 value. So that's going to be my darkest dark. So I don't want to have anything else quite as dark as this. This needs to be the most intense dark. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to lift up the pressure slightly that I put on the pencil and move to a 4 value. So 4 is 1 step lighter. And if you're cross-hatching, it's maybe just 1 set of pencil strokes instead, or possibly 2, but it's not as dark as the 5. So that's the key. So when I squint and I look at this, it appears to me that the roundest part of the tree facing away from the light is the 4, right in here. I can also see some on the log that's on the ground. So in order to paint that, I'm going to sketch, but I'm not putting as much pressure on the pencil this time. I'm barely putting any pressure. I'm making lots of linear strokes that are side by side, and I'm focusing my effort towards the center part of the tree because it's facing away from the light. So the shadow part would be towards the center. Now this tree is light because it's further away. So I'm not going to put any of my 4 value on that tree. This, when I need to be a little more precise, I choke up on the pencil and hold it like I would if I were writing ciphers on a page. This helps me to get any of the fine detail in for the darts. Then it's back to being loose. This September, I'll be teaching live in-person plein air painting workshops at Olana from the new Interpretive Center. So you get to stand where church once stood to make the painting of Olana, of the house, the main house, from the pond, the view from the pond. We'll be painting in a few other locations as well. And I'll be showing you this process and giving you format, pencils, clipboards, viewfinders and such so that you have the tools to do this at home and for your other plein air paintings. So please consider joining me in September. It will be September 10th, 11th, and 12th. And it's in person. So you get to hear all my funny jokes and we get to hang out and tromp through the woods together. that time of year, there's an amazing amount of mushrooms in the woods at Alana. So there'll be a lot of interesting textures to sketch and paint. Okay, once I have that 4 value in place, and I'm just making sure that I'm keeping some of the stronger darks in the forefront. Remember, one rule of perspective is that darks come forward, lights recede. So I'm keeping my strongest darks here. Next, I'm moving to the middle values. Now, we only have 5 values on this scale. Most artists will shoot for 9 or 10. But if you capture even just 3 values, you're capturing 3 dimensions, dark, medium, and light. If you capture 5 values, you're capturing that illusion of realism. So strive for at least 3 and shoot for 5 as a beginner. The first sketch you do should have at least 3, the next one 5, and challenge yourself so that you're seeing more and more values as you go. No one is born being able to see values. We all have to train our eyes. And you train them by doing exercises like this, where you sketch first and you make your 3 one step lighter than your 4. And you get in the habit of seeing the difference between these. It's subtle, but once you see it, you're able to see it again and again. It gets easier and easier. So if what I'm talking about sounds like Greek, or you look at it and it's like the emperor's new clothes, hang in there. The more you do this kind of work, the easier it gets. You have to train your eyes. So for the 3, when I squint and I look, there's a lot of 3. Everything in the foreground that isn't dark is a middle value. Then we have this tree, and we have some of the darks that are in the back that are closer to a 3. So I'm going to start off by putting this in. And this is that misty looking tree that's off in the distance. It has a few sketchy branches. I'll use the pencil for these sketchy branches. This is a pencil I'm using, but some artists prefer charcoal. Charcoal is wonderful for sketching. It's very forgiving. If you sneeze on it, it automatically disappears. So it's easy to erase. And other graphic artists often use Coptic pens that have different values and color temperature. Use what's comfortable for you, what's easily packable. You know, I often think of Church and Cole and other Hudson River School artists, especially the women who carried all of these materials out into the woods. Now, the women had to do this wearing bustles and heels and long skirts, shimmy up some of the rock faces, and pass their easels up with all their materials in them. So clearly, you don't want to be carrying a whole bunch of markers and pens and equipment with you. So having a single pencil is light enough and easy enough that you'll be able to do your value sketch with no fuss if you're working in plein air. The bark on this tree, the tree itself is very vertical. So I change my sketch marks to make the sketch marks vertical. I want my pencil to follow the direction of the subject always. I'm going to put a little rough texture with the point of the pencil, and that will help it read a little more like bark. All right. I also see this 3 value on the edges of each of these trees. So I'm going to get a little finer with my stroke using the pencil. And you can see how this helps to create a more rounded shape to the tree in the process. And make the bark a little more ragged. I'm spending a lot of extra time on this value sketch because I'm nervous and I'm doing this in front of people. But if I were by myself sketching for a painting, I would only take about 10 or 15 minutes. It's a quick study and it's not meant for anyone to ever see. It's meant to be thrown away. I'm going to make all my mistakes on this scale and not on my finished painting. I have never once regretted doing a value sketch, but I have often regretted skipping that step. I compete professionally at Plein events, and it's a pain in the butt to take 15 minutes when you only have 2 hours to make a painting, and to take that first 15 minutes and do a value sketch. But I still do it because in my head, as I'm sketching, I'm making lots of little micro decisions, which will make the painting process go smoother and more quickly. So in my head, I'm thinking, okay, that's my focal point. I'm going to draw people's eye there. Okay, this is not all that important. Maybe I'll leave this part out. Okay, this is the same value as the trees in the background. So how can I switch this up and make one appear closer and one further away? You know, if you jump right in, it's easier to make mistakes. But if you have a dress rehearsal in a value sketch, you're making your mistakes with paper and pencil, and that's very easy to rectify. And it saves me a lot of time in my paintings. If you're wondering how plein air painters paint so fast, it's because of things like this. Once you get in the habit of doing value sketches and color studies, then you start to learn shortcuts and tricks that help you to get the scene on the paper or surface much quicker than if you were just plopping yourself down in the mountain pass and sketching without any preliminary work at all. I got to put that cookie branch in just because he did. One of the things I love about the Hudson River School paintings is they are very important scientific documents now, because without those paintings, we wouldn't know what some of the arboreal forests look like in the Hudson Valley. They were almost all clear cut to feed the mills and the furnaces. So some of these paintings give us a real taste of the community, the forest, you know, what was here. A lot of the paintings I've done in the Hudson Valley are historically significant to me because many of the small farms that I painted on are no longer here. They've been paved over and housing has been put up out in the fields where once cows roamed. So I think it's really important for us as artists to go out and document the world we live in. I don't live in the Hudson Valley anymore. I live in North Florida on a small sustainable farm. And one of the passions I have is going out to old Florida scenes, some of the springs, bayous, the Everglades, the wetlands, and so forth, and painting them painting what's there, even some of the downtowns, because we've got a huge population on this planet and a finite amount of space. And a lot of what was there 5 years ago is not even there anymore. So I love capturing these historic old buildings as well as forests and scenes while they're still here. And someday when I'm on my deathbed and I'm looking back through all those mental images, that's what I want to see in my head. Not what is in the place now, but what Catterskill Falls look like, how beautiful it is, what the views from 84 look like with the apples and the orchards in full bloom and so forth. All right. So we have almost all the threes in place. I'm just creating strokes in different patterns to fill in the paper and create the illusion of texture and leaf litter on the forest floor. It isn't crucial in a value sketch to show every single detail. It's just crucial that you have in your mind later, I'm going to show that this is different colors of leaves, that there's a pattern of sunlight that breaks through the branches and illuminates part of it. This is all just texture. Maybe there's a few little plants that come up out of the leaf litter. The plants that are in the foreground are going to be taller and clearer. The plants that are in the middle ground are going to be lighter, more middle-sized. Plants in the background are going to be grouped together very light. And the size of the plants will also create that illusion of perspective. So now we move to the 2 value. 2 is light, but it's not as light as a 1. 2 is considered reflected light. So in this forest scene, where you see reflected light might be some of the light in the field reflecting off the grasses, some of the light filtering through the trees and the forest floor, maybe some coming through the branches up high. So to get a 2 value, I very lightly touch the pencil to the paper. So I'm hardly putting any pressure on it at all. This is about the lightest you can go and still be putting graphite on the paper. You don't want to make it too dark, then it becomes a 3. So here I'm just lightly sketching in some of the shapes behind the trees. I'm leaving some white paper for some of the birch trees that you can see the bark in the distance. I'm making it just subtly darker towards the center of those trees. When you're painting trees, never, ever, ever paint every leaf on the tree. For one thing, it'll take you the rest of your life. For another, it won't ever look right because your eye is only going to perceive parts of the leaves, some leaves. So instead, artists paint them as what's called value masses. So the trees, we mass all those leaves together as a big leaf shape. And then we punctuate it with sky holes, which are openings up in the canopy, like right here, where you can see the sky coming through. So I'm not going to put any leaves right in there. I'm going to leave some space for a sky hole where the sky is punctuating that canopy and coming through. Now that I have some of the other values in place, I think my darks are not as dark as I wanted them to be. So I'm making them a little bit darker. You can see why it's important to start off strong and dark. You know, a lot of people wonder why Church's paintings are so dark. And part of it is when you're painting in the forest, the trees do cut a lot of the light, and it actually is pretty dark. But another is that the pigments used back then, the umbers and so forth, were more natural pigments and decayed quicker and became dark. So there were some technical issues with paints and varnishes that made them darken and made the paintings appear even darker. You notice this more in Renaissance paintings because they're far older, like Caravaggio. You know, some of the darks, obscure details and colors that were once more visible. Pigments today are more light fast. They're also not quite as true as the ones that were around back then because we don't have the same minerals that we had. Okay, once I get to the twos, I have most of my darks in place. And what's left now are lights. Being a pastelist, I don't have an eraser. I don't hardly ever use one. You can't really erase pastel that well. Instead, I add light. So this is a stick for adding light. This would be a one. One is basically white paper. Or if you're using a medium like wash or colored pencil, you can go back in and add light. That's for dry sketching. Now, the main ones in our reference photo are the intense lights where the sun is hitting the bark on the tree. So that's really the lightest light. And again, you find that by squinting. When you squint, it shows you what areas are the lightest light. So this gives me a little sliver of light. I'm going to follow that pattern of light through. There's some light hitting the forest floor. A little light on the edge. Little light on the edge here. And basically, I'm just looking at any place where Church put highlights on his painting. All right, so this is essentially 5 values from dark to light. What I would probably do as a pastel artist is rub this with my finger so that it starts to disappear into the distance a little more and becomes more unified as a two. Oh, that was a sky hole. Oops. So the more textured your strokes are, the more the shapes come forward. The lighter and less textured, the more it recedes in space. So that also helps create that illusion of perspective. Now, I mentioned doing a color study as well. And the color studies are a second step after the value sketch. So not every artist is going to do a color study. Because I use pastels, I choose my colors based on the value. So if this was my darkest dark or my 5 value there, then the colors that are the same value as that would be these. If this is, well, actually, I think I got these mixed up. If this was a 4 value, then these would be my colors. That would be the 4 value. If this were the 3 value, these would be my colors that are middle. So they're right in middle tones. They're not dark. They're not light. And on up. So these would be the 2s. These would be the 1s. Now, when I lay out my palette, I lay them out according to those numbers. So this is what I call VIP seating. And I have the numbers right here. And I put the values according to those numbers. And I paint that way. I know that sounds a little crazy and maybe just a bit OCD, but it works for me. And I can move quickly through the composition that way, through the painting. Here's another example. This is a value sketch. This is trying some cypress trees in the distance. I liked the cypress trees. I wanted to incorporate a strong central shape. So I worked on getting that bird proportionate. When it was proportionate, I scaled it up and I did a color study. This is the color study of it. I always like my studies better than the finished product, which you'll find the more you do studies, the more relaxed you are when you paint them. And so the more likely you are to not like the finished product as much. And the finished product I'll show you in just a moment. Before we leave the easel, I wanted to put the color version back up so that you could see the values in color on Church's painting. So you can see I was true to keeping the darks in the foreground, and it helped to create some distance and aerial perspective, which is where the darks recede and the cools come forward. Lighter colors come forward, recede. Darks come forward, lighter colors recede. There we go. All right, now if you don't mind turning the camera back to me. Right behind me over here is the work in progress that I showed you my color study for. So give you an idea of the scale. My color studies are not usually this big. They're usually, this big. They're small and on paper, but I was planning on doing something a little bigger. And I've noticed that Church did this in the past too. When he was doing some of his more monumental pieces, he would do some smaller studies and versions of them before scaling them up to do something larger. So the piece behind me is 24 by 36. It's a little bit larger. This one is 11 by 14 for the color study. The sketches I do are always 3 by 5, 4 by 6, and so forth. Okay, at this point, I believe we are ready for some questions and Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Shawn, thank you so much. That was such a treat. I feel like I really needed that just to be able to make art with somebody else, and just to kind of have like such warm and wonderful, comforting words walking us through the process. I can't thank you enough. That was such an enjoyable exercise. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, at this time, we have saved some time for Q&A. So if you do have any questions for Shawn, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A function. It's on the bottom of your screen. On the black bar, it says Q&A. And I think before we turn to other people's questions, I have a couple of my own that I kind of thought of while we were sketching there together. My first question has less to do exactly with the exercise, but as we're Olana and we're the studio, home, and design landscape of Frederic Church, I'd be curious to know when you first came across a work by Church. Was it a painting? Was it the landscape here at Olana? What was your first encounter? And could you maybe tell us a little bit about it?
I would be honored. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this may come as a shock, but I was actually a shy and awkward child and would sketch quite a bit. So I had a love of sketching and art. And I went to the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth. I was born in Dallas. And I went with my mom at the time on a visit. And this was my first time ever going to a museum. I was incredibly impressed and awed by the structure. And it had just opened. I was maybe about 3 feet tall. I think I was 7.5, almost 8. And the first thing that we saw when we walked into the museum was Frederic Church's icebergs. And that painting and most of Church's paintings that wound up in museums and so forth was heroic in proportion. It was huge. It engulfed me as a small child. And I think I was about even with the crow's nest from a ship that sunk, which is towards the center part. He often put focal points in the center, on the bottom or the top, which was very odd. And I was eye to eye with it. And so these icebergs loomed around me, luminous and huge. And it was not like a photo. It was like reality, surreal reality. Like it was well above hyper reality, you know?
Yes.
And I felt instantly cold and at awe and couldn't believe that a place like that could exist or that anyone could ever paint it as beautifully and elegantly as he did. And at that moment, the die was cast for me. And I said, I want to learn to paint like that. And so on my quest to learn how to paint.
That is such a beautiful story. And I mean, I think for so many young students who are, venturers who find their way into museums and things like that, I similarly first encountered Frederic Church work I'm from Maryland, so I often went to the Smithsonian museums, and so my first encounter was with Niagara. And I do remember being a little one and kind of looking up and we often say it's Niagara is it's Niagara with the roar left out. And I remember being like, wow, I can almost hear that falling water. It's so visceral and so experiential. And we do have a couple of questions that are coming through in the chat. And so I did want to take a moment to address some of what folks are talking about. And I think I'll start with Francis, who asks, any thoughts about the twisted circular branch in the middle near the top that doesn't quite look right? And I wonder if, Francis, your question is kind of how might you approach doing a complicated branch, or how might you approach a tricky section of your composition?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right. We were just talking about some of the oddities that church includes in paintings. And the branch is towards the middle, and the circle in it is so eye-catching. Yes, that it really is. I think these are often compositional devices used to pull you through so that your eye doesn't land and rest in a particular place, but it follows the branch like a path through the whole composition. I was mentioning the lookout crow's nest on that one mast in the icebergs painting, and you'll notice that it points into the composition, so it draws you from the outside in like an invitation to be part of the painting. And I think that's why he probably included some of these. I couldn't speak for him, but that's what I would do.
I appreciate that so much, Shawn, because, and I'll out myself here, just hold up my value sketch. In mine, Francis, I completely omitted this branch because I felt intimidated by it and it was very complicated. But that choice of words, like an invitation into the painting, I don't know, what a kind gesture of church. So maybe I'll go back and include his invitation in my sketch. We have another question that's a little bit more practical of a palette and pastel centered about material. From Robert, says, would you be able to suggest what modern paint colors would be similar to Church's palette? In other words, what limited palette would you suggest? Are you familiar with any particular brand of pastels or palettes that might mimic the older paints that Church was using back in the 19th century, Shawn?
Yeah, I had a friend who runs a pigment store in New York City, and he used to tell me a lot of factoids. I love factoids. My head is filled with useless information and trivia that no one would ever want to know, and that's why I don't get invited to dinner parties. But, but some of the pigments, the big change is that we've used them up. So a lot of them are finite, and they're hard to find. Some of them are toxic. The cobalts, the ultramarines, the chromiums, the cadmiums. Any of those are made with heavy metals, and they're highly toxic to use. And people back then weren't that conscious of it and would often absorb these and get sick. Yeah. Which is why they stopped using lead white. Lead white was real popular with landscape painters, and Church probably used it too, but many people dropped like flies from a horrible, debilitating illness as a result. So the pigments we have today are a little different. To be honest with you, oil is sort of like a second language to me. It isn't my primary. Pastel is. I adore pastel. It's like finger painting for adults, so I'm all in. I do use oil and acrylic when I demonstrate and teach, so I'm not as well versed in the pigments or the makeup of oil and acrylic as I am in pastel. In terms of recommending a limited palette, what I highly recommend is that you start off with the basics. And that would be like cadmium red medium, cadmium yellow medium, ultramarine blue, raw umber, titanium white. And then you learn how to mix all of the other colors based on those. This is the simplest palette you could possibly have. Once you become proficient with those colors, add a warmer and a cooler version of each color. So for red, I would have alizarin crimson and cadmium red medium. For yellow, I would have lemon yellow and cadmium yellow light. For blue, I would have ultramarine and cerulean. And you can mix warm and cool, or you can mix cool and cool and come up with hundreds of different colors that would be very similar. I wouldn't have a palette that has 20 hues of green. Never do that. Learn how to mix green. There are many different paths to green. I mean, you can mix black and yellow and get green. You know, there's so many other ways, and the colors are richer and more lifelike than if you pour it out of a tube onto your palette and go.
I appreciate that. And I feel like, starting simpler and then like working your way and seeing how much you really do need to purchase or how much you really do need to add. And I feel like that was kind of the lesson I took from the exercise today as well. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
No, when you're just starting out, you really got to keep it simple because there's so much out there. I mean, we live in a world that is chock full of art supplies that didn't exist when Church and Cole were alive. I mean, you have hundreds of thousands of new things and new methods of application. So it's crazy.
Yes, absolutely. I do want to let folks know we're a couple minutes past 7, so if you do have to log off, everyone, feel free. But we do have a couple more questions that I'd love to spend some time answering, Shawn. One is from Hillary, and it says, when painting outside, as you know, the light changes quickly. So would it be considered cheating to take a photo of a scene so you can have a reference photo to refer back to if needed? What are your thoughts?
Oh, Hillary, thank you for an excellent question. And in my mind, all of these things are tools. I don't believe that there is any such thing as cheating. But you ask another artist, they'll tell you something totally different. Mm-hmm. It is a personal decision that you must make. Now, I happen to love cameras. I have the coolest iPhone with apps that will do color studies and value sketches, and I use them all of the time for my own edification. Now, AI interprets the landscape way different than we do. So when you shoot a picture of a scene like the forest floor, AI is going to average all of those darks together and make them very dark. It's going to average all the lights together and make it really light. So your contrasts are going to be different than what they are in person. So what I often do is I use my camera for the composition to help me determine what I'm going to paint. When I first get to a site, I'll just walk around, get a feel for the land, and maybe shoot 10 photos. And with the composition lines, the rule of thirds lines. So that helps me to see, how am I going to frame this scene? What makes the strongest scene? And then once I pick that scene, I may run it through the app that I use. I'll put in the chat box right now. Is called Pixto. And the other app I use is called Value Sketch. And they're both free. And Pixto will blur an image so that it's like you're squinting and looking at it. So I like it for that. Value Sketch shows me 5 or more values of that sketch. So if I'm having a hard time differentiating where the 3s and the 4s are, I can look at that and it'll show me the difference real quick. And then I still do my sketch. And I still do my color study. But I use the camera to help me with other things. Now, having said that, Church and all of the members of the Hudson River School rarely, if ever, did a finished painting on site. What they most often did were small studies that they would take back to the studio and then use that as the basis for larger paintings. Which means that, they would have used a camera. And you should too. And it's very helpful for getting the lay of the land. Also, when I'm painting in plein air and a lovely creature like this comes and lands in the water right in front of me, I can't paint fast enough to get it in there. So I'll whip out my phone, snap a picture, And then when I get home later, I'll add the bird into the scene with that that device. I wrote an article in this current issue of Pastel Journal magazine about how to do that. So if you're interested, check out the winter edition of Pastel Journal.
That's awesome. And maybe we can send that link around to everyone. We'll send in a follow-up email to folks, and maybe we can include that article in the link, along with the Pixto and Value Sketch apps. And I so appreciate you giving us the permission to use the technology available to us in our own day, just like, you know, Church likely would have used all the technology available to himself during his day. That's a wonderful way of looking at things. I did want to wrap up our time together, but before I do want to give a plug. Shawn, you will be here at Olana this September, and you'll be leading a few workshops. I believe it's September 10th through 12th. So once that is up on our website, we'll send it around to all of the folks who joined us here tonight. And if you want to send your value sketch that you created this evening to us, we can share it out with the wider group. Just send it to education@olana.org. Again, that's education@olana.org, and we'll send it out to the group in that same post-program email. But for now, well, thank you, Shawn. I really appreciate you joining us. And this was such a wonderful way to end the day.
It is always a great honor and a pleasure to work with you and the whole gang at Olana. And Olana is sacred ground for painters. If you haven't visited in person in a while, make it a point. Don't let a year go by before you go there. I've put my email address and my website up on my easel. If anyone has any questions that I didn't get to and you'd like to ask me personally, please feel free. I'd be happy to answer your questions. And thank you all for your patience.
Thank you so much, Shawn, and I'll see you in September.
Wonderful. Can't wait.
Wonderful. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks so much.